Dodar Cherdo Nyanamo Nilo Leje Chando Donze Mare Munsele Dongala Nyungo Jinye Chuze Raldi Nam Dene Dajin Sanchu Tarase Yende Luzo Jalase Tubigo Churta Chudan Chunye Gente Dalu Munsele Jambe Yang La Du Omara Bazana De Omara Bazana De Omara Bazana De Omara Bazana Umara Bazana De Omara 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 Bazana Zana Deo Marabazana 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 Umarabazana Umarabazana de Zeden Jide Ken Rabo Sre de Talu de Mo Memba Rabsalane Kadan Denje Shun Lo Don Ba Ye Lo Tre Po Be Nang Wa Zalando Solo Gang Ce Da War De Ba Ham Chung Se Te War De Na Yang Gombo Jamyang Chen He Ne Keng Me Pa Ya Thong Wa Rai Sho Ninja Chenpe Tse De Ning Me Shen Sung Ne Me Lam Chen Po Nga Ja Ta Pe Kara Tar Nga Chen Do Cher Men Do Ten Pa Tu Je Chen La Chang Ca Lo Wu Jin Chong Long Pen Men Tong Po Le Jal We Nam Chun Rang Shen Ren Je Tu Chen Zo Pe Je Yuen Den Chong Pa Long Wa Pe Ma Jung Ne Tang Le Pe Cho Ro E Jung Lu Zhup Tong Me Arya De Wan Tang Yin Nian Chong Lang Chu Di Chao Pe Sha Yuen Den Yue Tang Sha Je Yue Lang So Jian Zhu Chong Nian Nam La So Lo Wa De We Ma Wei Sen Ge Kang Ge Ri Pe Me Se De Long Nian Chang Zin Gun Se Yang Chen Pe Bao Ju Ru Du Zhi Gu Nian Pa Rong Sim Che Je Sang Bo Jia Ren Ju Ru E Che Kang Re Tue Ge Le Ren Che Ning Pe Gu Lo Yuen Den Kun Zhong Ga Yue Jie Ca Le Du Ning Pe Dun Do Be Be Na Ju Ru Pa Dong Chen Rang Zham Xia La So Lo Wa De Be Re Dong Jian Pa Le Xun Nu Jin Lam Le Gong Be Long Ne Po Be De Je Lu Long Do Xuan Zhen Jiang Cu Nga Wang Ju Ru Me Pam Jian Yang Nam Jian La So Lo Wa De Be Hong Men Xue Jie Yin Jie Po Zhang Ne Du Sum Sang Jie Gun Jie Ngo Ni Rang Sim Che Gu Ru Ngun Sum Dun Ze Pa Zai Yue La Min Xia La So Lo Wa De Be Deyang zhuwa namke tata nyambe simche tamche dungar gyunde nye dang zhalde. Topja lana me pa yang dakpar zogbe sanje je gobang rinpo che la gopar jiwo, te che do tambe che te nye senche tsurshen do nyamsun langwara jiwo nyambe samba changchu chodo tuke pa rinpo che sal tabi gone sembar shu. Kaan sembar chawe choge rinpa ne kebe tsulla jubi ngo she chawe tencho tenye Himbaren de la yang kebara chawe ne ju choge domshi soso yang dakwe rikpa shi kune yoba le tangbo kebara chawe ne ju de la yang pungbo kam geche tendel ne tan nimin wangbo dus sine shu tum ne tanda tene ne keba denpa la keba sendi denpa la keba de la yang denpa shi la zhang neba tang tene denpa shi re shindu tene sine yungge yoba le tene tangbo dungal denpa de shu tene nyepa kunjung ge denpa ikab la yins kunjung de la yang le tang nyomongba ni ki kone kunjung denpa kor la sungge yoba le tene le di kor la shu tene tanda tene nyomongba ki kor la yin sene nyomongba tenzo la yang tene nyomongba ki mingi namdang da nyomongba kewa ki gyu da den nyomongba ki chele ki kone ming dame na so ta yo ba le tene tering kapsu baba de tene nyomongba tenzo ta pang na kandesne 통람당 공람된 라 양방 방당 제례 간대 여기서 된데 거라 슈트입니다. 되게 님보 된저기 양 님보 자술기 거라 어디에 거라 레데요.
At the beginning of class, please give rise to bodhicitta, thinking, may all sentient beings, who are as numerous as the sky is vast, attain a state that is free from suffering and the causes for suffering, and may all those sentient beings be established at the level of perfect and complete awakening, the state of a perfect Buddha. And may I be able to establish those beings though at that level, and for that reason may I now study and then put the teachings correctly into practice. With that kind of motivation, please engage in your studies. The text that we're studying in this class is The Gateway to Knowledge, the treatise entitled The Gate for Entering the Way of a Pandita by Jamgon Mipam Rinpoche. And generally the text is outlined by three main sections. First come the 10 topics of expertise, then the 4 seals of Dharma, and finally the fourfold correct discrimination. And we are currently discussing the first one of those 3, the 10 topics of expertise. We've already covered the topics of the aggregates, the elements, the sense sources, interdependence, the correct and the incorrect, the faculties and time. And currently we are concerned with the 8th topic, which is the topic of the truth. And after a listing of the 4 noble truths and explanation of their order, then we moved on to an individual discussion of each of the 4 noble truths. We've completed the discussion of the truth of suffering, and we are currently discussing the truth of origin. The truth of origin is further divided into an explanation of karma and an explanation of disturbing emotions. And the first one of those we have already covered, and we're currently discussing disturbing emotions. In the discussion of the disturbing emotions, we have already seen a number of topics like the different names that can be given to the disturbing emotions, the different causes for the disturbing emotions, different synonyms and lists of disturbing emotions based on their functions, and so on. And currently we are discussing the question of how they are abandoned, if one wants to abandon those disturbing emotions, particularly on the path of seeing and the path of cultivation. How does that work? And now particularly what kind of antidotes or remedies are necessary to discard the afflictive emotions, the disturbing emotions.
네, 이제 디와 지글라 가르도 최탐제 돈바 다음에 남바 일라 제베스 디네 디일라 제베 다음에 되는 일라 제베스나 다디 간데 나스는 디와시도 데라 다음에 되는 일라 제베스 디갈라 최 이제 최탐제 다나 예와 망보 시에나양 조데다 다음에빈 된낭라 뒤데레스 최탐제 랑시 마두바 디디게 랑시 마두바 강임바 디게 아니 일라 제바세 일라 이스나 셈라 다디 냐르고레스 셈라 하고르체고레스 남다 디랍드사마 일라 제바세 디갈라당아조 디 다음에 된 시에바스 다음에 된 하고와 라바나신제 다디 일라 제바스 디갈라 양 세 ngaranzo namjuge sem lo namdong dan chebi goni yela chebas tene keze chimikse kan mare diri kapla yang tsik denzo kapla yang rau legire kap tenda de kapto la ha ko re sen song dadi ngazo pena tangme be tön sheba sen lamna halam ma do ngana zo tamal ki sheba de yinang rau samgire yang denzo mare sheba sri kana tangme be tön de surishin do kande imba de to to wala ya do ha ko to wa dende ki tönda ko giro pe tina shingi tanda duru yang tangme be tön gi namba yila sheba sen lamna tangme be tön de 담이 임바데 또고래 담이 임바데 하고 고고유레스 고고유레 하고 도유레 고고유레 라이로 tindekijares tinde shweni sik dawre na den kha 고고유레스 yela chebasna 지단계 가족이 분바 yela chewa kawa yela cheba ane 대당 자나 지금 뭐 속다들 예라 제바선디 타말게 게제 예라 제바지안 요레스 단단한 두루 다음에 비튼 예라 제바선 남나 양 다음에 비튼데 셰바 또 바이던다래 양디 예라 제바선나 남주이 규마디 예라 제바디랑 마레스
nam me begoni
오 디르게자리
So we had a couple of questions from last week, and the first one was with regard to this mental image that is mentioned here in paragraph 1004, where it says, moreover, in order to master all phenomena, attentiveness to the mental image of non-self within that state also brings all other mental images, such as impermanence, to completion. So actually, this is a note from the translator, one could also translate it more as mental engagement. Mental engagement with that object. Here, when it says attentiveness to the mental image of non-self, then we need to understand that there are many, many different phenomena and many different things that we need to understand, that need to be realized, need to be known. But the meaning of all of that, the meaning of the nature of all of that comes down to, or can be summarized in the fact that phenomena are not truly established. And so that means that there is no inherent self to phenomena. And this is something that we need to know. When it says here mental image, just means that it's the mind that needs to engage in that meaning that the mind needs to know that, needs to come to realize that. So all we're talking about here with this attentiveness to the mental image of non-self is that we need to come to know, apprehend, realize the selflessness of phenomena, or selflessness. And even though the words are very similar here with this mental image translation specifically, but even with just mentally engaging in that, it sounds very much like our usual mental engagement based on conceptuality. But that's actually not meant here. Sometimes we have terms like this mental engagement where the words sound very much alike, but actually the meaning is quite different. Here, this is a more general talk about needing to understand, needing to realize without conceptuality, selflessness. The words are actually similar, quite the same to the way that we usually talk about common understanding, common engagement with an object based on conceptuality, engaging the mind, directing the mind towards a certain object. But that's not what is meant here. So here's really what is meant here with this mental image of non-self is just the understanding, the true understanding of reality, the realization of selflessness, two types of selflessness, and really needing to know that there's no inherent self to phenomena. And in short, it's actually referring to a non-conceptual way of engaging with an object here rather than the conceptual way, which we would usually understand when words like this are used, like the mental engagement or mental image.
Tiwa Kagashidi Parche maybe lam la soba dadi lam nyembo lam tenzo ko la khashishidu sta tenzo lam nga do tendela chardang kandina sto kichishida tatanda duru parche me lam namro lams di tenzo zo ta taksim bi nyembo la do lam tenzo de ane zo chewa de tatanda de tonglam ne yala ane chargyores de kejade tene parche melams ta penanga zo tonglam kabla dungal demba de la musu lokar shungne jikta tang tharta tang ane ji maripa thesum la so bayerwa tenzo dang ane musu korong ane 지 미다베 랑신 임바 동알베 랑신 임바 다메베 랑신 임바 딘데 소다 냠도 툭툭이로와 안드리 갑텔라 드네 바르체메 람스 데조 체와다오데다 통람 갑라 차르네 안데네 셰규레스 드네 디 모투네 딜레 디게 미다 동알 동담에 라소바게 된 적이 모투네 데 로투와데 진투와데라 아니 남도 람스 텐돌레장 다 통람 갈라베나 동알 데메 갈라 빵자 아니 직다당 베나 타다 아니 지 딱무유수 록슈 지겐당 아니 록바 록슈당 아니 왕기 록슈 지겐 탐젤레 타 링상 도에나 타심바스 어디는 조디다 통람기 카톡 다가랑 라데네 고에레스 디 데셰 캡사데 아니 예나야다 조양 심바든 졸라 고아도 삼로도 땅나 페나 초람 갑라 졸람 갑라 라랑 소소게 갑기 빵자데 당 냠보니데 냠도 툭네 다 냠보고 왕라 로이 갑데라 바르체멜람 냠보다 슉체로 무투니 조와데라 남도람 데네 냠보 코나 슉침보 조와데라 타스미 람스 다 숨짐바스디갈라다 아니 쩐된조라 쩐니도 따와 베나 동알게 당신 방모셔와도 어딘조 리도와 딘더스
So then we had another question, and that was with regard to the different kinds of paths that we have seen last week. We spoke about the path without impediment, the path of liberation, and so on. And so the question was how to apply that to the 5 paths and how to understand these different kinds of things that are mentioned here, the path without impediment, the path of liberation, and then also the completion. And so when we speak about the path without impediments or the obstacle-free path, then this means a path, like an aspect of practice where one has adopted the method to abandon the discards. So for a particular, it's the identification of a particular path where the antidotes for the particular discards are present. So that is from the path of seeing onwards, for example. And that means that the mistaken engagements, the mistaken engagement in the real, the mistaken engagement in the awareness, and the mistaken engagement in the induced mistaken engagements are not embraced anymore. So anything that falls into those categories with regard to the path of seeing, and then with regard to the seeing of a particular truth, like, for example, the grasping to the transitory collections as the self, the mistaken views, the extreme views, and so on. If one does not engage in them in this awareness way, so if there's no mistaken engagement in reality in light of these disturbing emotions, then the nature of phenomena to be impermanent, suffering, selfless, and empty can be directly seen. That is the path of seeing. And if that is so that is when these mistaken engagements cease, or when we stop to mistakenly engage in the objects through these mistaken engagements, then the antidote against the disturbing emotions, the discards, is there, and it functions. So the path without impediment means the path of seeing, where the antidote is functioning against the discards. When one is then able to continuously uphold that, so if one has a continuum of not wrongly engaging in those aspects, so from the second moment onwards, then that's the path of liberation. So if we take, for example, the truth of suffering, seeing of the truth of suffering, there are different discards that are abandoned when the truth of suffering is seen on the path of seeing, right? There's the view of the transitory collections, there is the extreme views, and so on. And so when the antidote functions to those discards, then that's the path. So the first moment is the path of no impediment, or without impediment, and then the continuation is the path of liberation, when these are not present anymore, these discards. And then eventually, if it has been so this can also be described in terms of becoming stronger. When it becomes stronger and continuously improves the power, the strength of these of the realization of the antidotes, and the discards are not present anymore, that's then the path of liberation. And then when they have come to culmination, when there's no discard anymore at all, that's then also the completed path, the path of no more learning. So we can apply this to the path of seeing in particular, but this path without impediment and the path of liberation. But we can also look at the path of accumulation or the path of joining in terms of their own particular discards, and then the antidote that works against these discards. When the antidote and the discard are there present together, then that's the path without impediment. And then when the antidotes become stronger and stronger and have worked against the the discards, then that's the path of liberation.
이제 숨진배 님보 람승인데 초lam 당 안에 뻥윈 님보 parche 람승인데 다 졸람 당다 통람 조체와드네 남돌람 곰람 타심바대양 곰람 다 디라울라양 지토는 잘나양
Dianke sorona.
나서 님보 라 님보 라 시대선 숨진비 님보스 안에 뻥윈 님보 parche 람래 시대기 님 남돌 람스 디 가시지도 알아 어딘조데 네 당보 숨진비 님보 사실은 님익수 따와라는데 촉조르니 갑라죠 아니 parche 메비 람생데 통람라 샤나 남도 람스나 곰람 탁심바스나 양 곰람당 되네 멜롭람 되라 양 람가라 차나 다 지당 가르라고 인지민지다 간데라지 인앙다 삼나다 하람 다디로지 차대로도 다 지당 남준 지당 계제시리 갈라다디 통람당 곤람니 콜라 차니 계제시리 parche 멜람 승인데 당디 남도람데 다 parche 멜람 남도람데 조다 통람랑 차네 탁심바된 조다 곤람나 차니 시기도 하나.
So there are different ways that we can apply this concept of the path without impediment and the path of liberation. Actually, here we are discussing in paragraph 105, we're discussing the 4 remedies. And we could apply these 4 remedies to the paths. So the remedy of remorse would apply to the path of accumulation and the path of joining. The remedy of abandoning, which is identified with a path without impediment, would be the path of seeing. And then the path of liberation would apply to the path of cultivation. And then the completion of the path would be the 4th one, the remedy of keeping distance, of having been separated from the discards. So that would be the path of no more learning. This is one way that we can think about the path without impediment and the path of liberation. But more general way is also to apply to the path of seeing in particular. And so looking at the path of seeing and the path of cultivation, identifying the path without impediments as the entrance into the path of seeing, and then the path of liberation as the continuation from that.
가상기 트니말라 탁싱비 냠본네스 데 고메람이노스 다 냠보게 제단기 왕게 녀몽바들 냠보 제단기 왕게 계제시데 탁싱비 냠보 생주여스 다 디데 아니 데이 공메람남이노 세다는 야강라 parche 멜람당 남로람 대조콜라 계제실랩사라 디네 데네 모투네다 야 공기 람된조 인생 디레랍디 갑라다디 할람 곰람 된조 탁승와 스디갈라다 빵자 녀몽바 된조 레장 할람 다 탁릉도 송와 냠보데 출라 빵자 녀몽바 된조 탁릉도 땅와데 된조 인생 공미람 냠보네 디 공미 람낭 이노스 tane namro lam tharchin parche melamda namro lam tharchin di kongmi lam denzo ins ni sungare do dinne kundu tarte zona chesul shen yodo dandadru ya kangla sung shanjo denzo de ngomba kundu tardo tatinde ins dine ngomba zogi loksu tana chesul shen yos chesul shen na pena parche mepe lam dang namro lam tenzogi mingla ane penna parche mepa sen nyembo penna de nyembo mit tungal denbai wangdo samno tangna dungal dembe chö dan de mita pa dungal wa tongba dame be rangshin yimba di de la di yimba de la ya dene mutu니 ne tuba parche kayang mebi gone ane dinde de shekyagido dine ngomba zo lungso la shenyang ane dungal demba yimba la dungal demba yimba ane sö tuba dungal chösu serwa ane dana shen kunjung demba yimba la kunjung demba ge netsul de la ane söto ba kunjung le da nyumba tene lamde ane pena goba topja imba la topja ni do söto ba ane söba tene lamde la yang söto ba o tendesne 동알 취시비 써봐 아니 군중 취시비 써봐 아니 고바 취시비 써봐 아니 람 취시비 써봐서 어딘저 디시자기도 안 저기로 쏠라 딘저기라 도란 디시자 다 써봐서나 단다데 동알 덴바데 시데가라 동알기 랑신 힘방 응원에 힘발라 셈라 이체게 두발라 동알 취시비 써봐서 군중대 레당 녀몽바대 시바 감정 코르발라 양양 저르도 주겐당 대 녀몽비랑신 임바 딘데라 예체바 아니 쇠토바 대안조 심정 스코비 심진도 된도 쇠토기 말아 배나 동알 임발라 동알 임바 셰기 말에 메다발라 메다바 셰기 말에 딱바 셰기래 미상발라 미상바 셰기 말에 장완이도 셰기래 다음에 반된다라 다음에 바 셰기 말에 쇠토기 말에 다 외래도 삼기를 된조 쇠미도 바라 다 쇠토바스나 동알라 임바 셰토바 쇠토바 이체요바 다나신 군중 레다 녀모바 된조 양라 쇠토바스나 그나 군중 레게 미게 된조 디우 담이나스 용기요바 될라 하고토바 아니 셰토바 이체토바 이체게바 어딘조나 쇠바스 다나신 람당 고바 된조기 내출 된조라 양 대따르도 고 람데 아니 주 톱제 임바단 고베 덴바데 톱제 임바니도 이체바데 되게 내출된 줄라 안에 이체바 딘데 중소나데 쇠바스 어디네 되셨잖아 됐다 남도 람 세디가라 따디 쇠토바데라 아니데 최된 줄라 되네 동알 덴베게 최게 내룩데라 쇠바 토바데라 무투니 최디 시에니 균투니 로바된조 되네 최셰바 동알 최셰바스 동알 구랑신 임바기 최되나 데이터도 임발을 최셰바 네 딜레 메도발라라 디무투니 로바 다나시 군중 된졸라 무투니다 균짐바기 돈다로지 레숭도아 남돌람 동 라솔 오틸라소 버틴데기다 데셰캡비레스 숭교레 저기낭라 다간다란 엄마 카데 데 통람기 단다 이셰기지 주줍스 아니 동알 최수 제시 라바낭신 지는 덴바시데라 디 시데 차르도나 아니 시시 주줍스도와 어디 주줍데 차르기도와 어디 차솔데 계자도 여도 숨이 계자는 전나 체줄신 여도 세는데 아니 동알 최시 동알 최수 선능의 단계 제시시 주인방 원디래 아니 최시에서나 아니 디 남돌람디 갑들라 고모투니 대바데 아니 제시에서나 디 탁승비 람디 나는 와 당원 버저기 로솔라 녀몽 같은 절에 탁 링도 땅에기 돈다라고 되는지 통람 이식기지 주주기 꼴라 계제 시당지 요래 원디 인도 송아래 저단나 체조 신야 요도
So we are currently on page 138, paragraph 1005. And we have reached the last of the remedies of the list of the 4 remedies. And the fourth one reads, the remedy of keeping distance is the path above that. So we have been looking at the disturbing emotions and their antidotes against those. So first came the remedy of remorse, then the remedy of abandoning. So that's the when there is the actual antidote present against the disturbing emotion, against the discards, and that's called the path without impediment. And then came the path of liberation, when the absence of the discards can be upheld and builds a continuum that is uninterrupted. And then the last point is the culmination of that, when one has really distanced oneself from the disturbing emotions, when the disturbing emotions have become very far away through the previous two paths. So through the path of without impediments and the path of liberation, when that all comes to completion, then one has truly distanced oneself from the disturbing emotions. And so that is then the last remedy, is that keeping the distance to the disturbing emotions, meaning that one has removed oneself from the disturbing emotions completely. And then it says here, these are consistent with the Abhidhamma Samuccaya. The Abhidhamma Kosha has another way of explaining them. Actually, there's a difference between the Abhidhamma Samuccaya explanation of the four remedies and the Abhidhamma Kosha explanation. So in particular, the path without impediment and the path of liberation and the completion of those are then in the Abhidhamma Kosha actually applied to the path of seeing itself. So the path without impediment refers to the presence of the antidotes that eliminate the discards. And that is, according to the Abhidhamma Kosha, the knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, the seeing of the truth of suffering, meaning that one sees that phenomena are by nature suffering, they are impermanent, they are suffering, they are unclean, and they are without self. So the four characteristics of suffering are suffering, impermanence, selflessness, and emptiness. And so when this continuation of the understanding, of the seeing of the truth of suffering cannot be interrupted, nothing can impede that, that's then the path without impediment. So with that antidote is present. And then following that comes then the knowing. So actually this applies to the seeing of the Four Noble Truths and the 16 moments of the seeing of the Four Noble Truths. Each of the Four Noble Truths seeing consists of 4 different instances. So with regard to the truth of suffering, then there's first acceptance, and then there's of the phenomena, meaning the acceptance of the truth of suffering, and that is then followed by the knowing of the phenomena, here the truth of suffering, and then the subsequent acceptance and the subsequent knowing. The same then also for the truth of origin, and then for the truth of cessation, and then for the truth of the path. Each of them goes, when seeing each of them, one goes through the stages of acceptance and knowing. So if you take suffering here as the example, acceptance here, first of all, means that one understands the nature of suffering and learns to trust that truth of suffering. For the truth of origination, this means that one accepts and learns to trust that karma and afflictive emotions are what propel rebirth within samsara. So back to the truth of suffering, usually ordinary human beings or ordinary beings do not have the capacity to really accept the truth of suffering, which is explained by the four characteristics of the truth of suffering, being impermanent, impure, suffering, and without a self. So acceptance means that these characteristics are then accepted. And one trusts that this is really the case. Subsequently, then the same holds true for the meaning of the truth of origin and so forth, for the truth of the cessation and the truth of the path likewise. For example, the truth of cessation needs to be understood as actually being that which is to be obtained. Cessation is what needs to be obtained. So trusting that and accepting that as a fact is this acceptance. And then so that was acceptance is the path of no impediments, or the path without impediments. And then the path of liberation is to really know the nature of those phenomena, so knowing, understanding, and truly knowing the nature of the truth of suffering and the other truths, and being able to uphold that knowledge, so that understanding, that seeing, that realization, so upholding it through in a continuum. And so that is then the path of seeing. So for the path of this is the path of liberation. So for the path of seeing, when we look at the Four Noble Truths and the 16 moments to the realization of the Four Noble Truths, then each of them gets this, each of the truths has 4 stages to it: the acceptance, the knowing, the subsequent acceptance, and the subsequent knowing. And the way that the Abhidhamma Kosha speaks about the path without impediment and the path of liberation is then that the acceptance is the path without impediment, and the knowing the phenomena is then the following part, which is the path of liberation. So according to the Abhidhamma Kosha, the 4 remedies can be applied to the 16 moments, and particularly these 2 paths. They can be applied to the 16 moments of the truth of seeing only.
통람 이제 계주 주족스나 동알 추수 추시 제수 제시스 어디 시대 동알 된발라 양 다나 신기 군중 된발라 군중 추수 추시 제수 제시스 양 다나 신기 고바 추수 제시 추시 제수 제시스 시 다나 신람 추수 아니 추시 제수 제시스는 어디 주족되라 시시시 주족되라 통남이 이제 계주 주족 근데 다단지 추수스는 단지 쉬워나 현재 고아데 당보데 단도를 년보 시스네 라비도 앞에 나나 순진비 년보스 디디벨라 속람단 저람간다 순진바스 끈니도 따네 동알된바기 안에 친누기 직대다 낭주기 셈제 디명라 동알된바 있는 가상야 동알된바 간다 시에서 따디 된조데라 아니 동알와나 초바 중사게 껴님반이도 따바데라 순진반님보스 디데 때사베 첼라 다 바르체 메빌람 뽕미님보 갑라레디 갑라 다 동알 최스스 아니 동알 최스스 다 때도 껴님반이 때사베 첼라 되니 껴님반이도 따툼 되니 동알임바 미다발라미 미다바 임바 다음에만 된데스네 로라 숑투바 이제 지투바 어딘서 명라드네 최선하게 그래서 최직 개찰납당직이 원도 당나 개찰납당직이 원도 당나 동알 발체 메비 람스 이러 아니 다음은 신기 양 지구지장을 군중 레다 녀몽바 델라 방보 야강라 님보나라 순진비 님보 생실래산데 군중 레 개와 미개와 된조당 묘몽바 된조데 아니 코르발라 아니 양양 깨를 줄긴당 양양 다 야강라 민망보시 따스와 삭바당 저로와당 아니 어딘데스 망보요와 코르발라 저르도 줄긴나서 어딘데 껴니도 따네 임바니도라 예체바 아니 딘데 셰tum나 군중 최세 색직랍당라 양 군중 발체 메비 람스 디밍라 다는 신다 된데 잘는 되레스 발체 메바스나 동알과 임바대당 내루 파기 동알 덴바게 최대 동알 덴바 임바당 추동 셰바데게 동알 덴바 임바 셰바 딩니 파룰라 디 발체 메비 동알 임바라 임바다도 무투님 디레스네 셰투바데 발체 파룰라 발체 메바 개차도지레도 안데니 무투니 도토나데 남도 람스네 라탄직라 직직라 단지 발체 메람 나와나 셰체네 라탄직라 남도 람스 동알 남도 람스 양 라탄직라 동알 최시스 어디네스네 데네디 뎀바시갈라 타티네 찬네 드레스 모마줄록솔라.
So according to the Abhidhamma Kosha, there are these 16 moments of the truth of seeing, and that means that the seeing of each of the noble truths has 4 aspects to it, or 4 moments. And so the truth of suffering has acceptance with regard to the truth of suffering, knowing of the truth of suffering, the subsequent acceptance and the subsequent knowing. Then the same for the truth of origin. There's the acceptance with regard to the truth of origin, then the knowing of the truth of origin, then there's the subsequent acceptance and the subsequent knowing with regard to the truth of origin. Same for the truth of cessation and the truth of the path. So in total there are these 16 moments of seeing the Four Noble Truths on the path of seeing. And so when we look at the 4 remedies according to the Abhidhamma Kosha, then the remedy of remorse applies to the path of accumulation and the path of joining. Remains the remorse that one gains when looking at the world and sentient beings, which we said are the truth of suffering, meaning that the world is the place where all this suffering manifests and beings. So, and that experience that. So, being fed up with that, being unsatisfied by the world and the beings in terms of experiencing them as suffering, acknowledging slowly that they are suffering and having regret, having remorse with regard to that is the path of accumulation and the path of joining. And then if one is able to directly look at that and is able to truly comprehend the full extent of the meaning of that, is able to honestly look and apprehend the truth of suffering for what it is, the world and sentient beings for being suffering. And that first is when the antidote is abandoning the discards, the misapprehensions, and one can directly see the truth of suffering. So that is also the path without impediment with regard to the truth of suffering. Then this is the stage of acceptance of the truth of suffering. And then the same holds true for the truth of origin, for example. First, on the path of accumulation and the path of joining, one develops remorse, where one develops an understanding of karma and afflictive emotions, and then that they are the causes for continuous rebirth within samsara. And one knows or gets to know that the different manifestations of karma and afflictive emotions. We looked at so many different names for them, the defilements, the bonds that bind one to the swamp of samsara, and so on. And so when one comes to the point where one can completely trust the fact of karma and afflictive emotions being the causes for suffering in samsara, then this is the path without impediment. When one can then, if one truly knows it, then, so that knowledge is continued, that's then the path of liberation. So really, when we look at the path of impediment, it's in the in-between phase of not seeing, directly seeing, not knowing, and really developing knowledge, knowing, realization of the truth of suffering, for example. So it's the very point, so this path without impediment is the very point between the discards being there and then having completely understood the truth of suffering. So it's whether we speak about the path without impediment or the about the acceptance of the truth of suffering, it's this in-between moment where the discard is removed and the antidote emerges. That's it.
제단계 탁승 와스나 강릉도 땅 와스 딜라 시즈로 유스 체니 미튠베 탁승 와데 초과직도 내장 체니 미튠베 마제바 링와르 주르바 사소 중화시스 초과직도 수고다우직라 중화시에나 매매 차위 랑신직당 사사 차포당 추추 렌시셔와 딘데기라서 라나수수 타릉불라 대유레스 체니 미튠바라 라나수수게 체니리 미튠바 다시 미튠 초기 양 타릉도 내와도다 배차샤나 출dim당 출dim 찰완이었다고 그래스 유남 바르체베세 링와 데페나 샤르게 자소당 너게 자소다 바루라 율당 지식 낙살라서 뭐뭐 받쳐 되고 된저 베나 타릉보 예베게자 타릉보기 뼈저 샤겨래 뒤지 정화데 아니 뒤 대바당 뒤 마옹바 중주를 짜고 된저 아니 뒤지 정화 타릉보 대여스.
Okay, so the last the remedies that we saw was the remedy of keeping distance. And now comes here a little explanation of what this keeping distance can refer to. Generally, there are actually 4 kinds of keeping distance, 4 ways of keeping distance. Paragraph 1006 reads, there are 4 kinds of keeping distance. Keeping distance based on dissimilar characteristics means to remain apart through the present of, though present in the same congregation, being unmixed and remote, as for instance the 4 elements of earth and so forth. So one understanding of keeping distance is that things do not mix up in their nature if they have different characteristics, completely different characteristics or qualities to them. So even though the elements of fire, which is hot and burning, and water, which is moist and creating coherence, is even though those 2 elements might be present, they do not mix in their nature. They stay separate from each other. One quality is the hot. One's quality is the hot and burning. The other one's is the moisture, and so they never just become one, even though they're in the same congregation. Even though they're, so that's one way of keeping distance, keeping separate, staying separate. Then the next one is keeping distance based on opposite types, such as, for instance, discipline and deranged behavior. So if 2 things are just completely opposites, then they never come together, they never mix up. So either there's discipline or there is deranged discipline, deranged behavior. And so that's opposing things do not come together. So there's this kinds of keeping distance between them by the fact that they're opposite things. Then keeping distance based on completely separate locations, like for example the Eastern Sea and the Western Sea. That means just in terms of location, things can be far away from each other. So when there are 2 oceans and a landmass that divides those, with mountains and forests, everything in between, then the 2 bodies of water stay distant from each other. There's a physical distance between them. And then keeping distance based on time, such as, for instance, the remoteness of past and future. So then the temporal distance is that between a previous time and a later time, there's a distance between those temporal locations.
Pangja penna tawa nga dan tamin ngau tau de pangja dembashi kapla tin ju pangja ti tau la ti tau pangwe ki tin dibu yung she ku se penna tawa nga nan jikta rau pangna jikta pangwa ki tame ba to bi she ba rau penna thechum rau pangso na yiche ki she ba rau yung she se marikba pangsona marikba maybe she ba rau 어디로 빵자 빵위 제부 용셰 구스나 지에 요소마레 디레 펜나 데비 동알 덴바당 군중 덴바강 갑지 빵자 동알 덴바가라 빵자 따왕하다 따밍가 군중 갑라 펜나 직다당 타다당 추림도슈 마임 바시베 둔보시 여러봐 둔 나스와 덴데지 망버지 마야강나 어디 빵자 디세 용데 갑텔라 디 갑텔라 빵자 빵사위 제라 또베 이시지 셰바주여라 어디 용셰 진짜 지에 요스다 용셰 구지디 갑라 베나 동알 덴바당 군중 덴바 빵자 세비 용셰 지익지 아니 양 고비 덴바기 방자 방와 차르비체라 데네 셰바지요레디 셰바당 니제 아니 람게 덴바게 방자 세비게 용셰다 제는 숨제 대 용셰 니데 숨세 다데 고람 고바다 람니들 카가 체 인숭기도데 데비 둥알당 군중 방자 세비 용셰 찍랑 라지 아니양 데 데비게 고바 방위 안에 용셰직 람방 용셰직 스카가지 인숭기도 방자 세비 용셰 니데 용셰 숨치 대신도 감공마 니 감공마 니기 양 이 야강의 지원은 세친이라 동알 군종 방위 용셰직 감공마기 고바다 람방위 용셰 감공마 니가기 대 참만 냠도 지샤르도 이 텐데치네 용셰 숨치 용셰 숨스디가라 야강라 지요는 세친네 감공마라양 텐데스니 용셰 숨도 지네 용셰 족스 통랑 파체 메베 람지 제보스 동알 덴바 힘바 시에와 데라 parche mebi kone ta tungal ke tembarangshing ngoshe tuwa de parche mebas ta choge chigi wangdu tangna tanda de tungal chusu labyon raw dirwa o de langso wa parche mebi lamgi tibos 용셰 족치 탐에 차든 방미 용셰 지익제나 용셰 둔바데 탐에 차든스나 감 타마 도감베게 차다 디디감라테네 방자를 기르바텐서라 곰비 남제 통난다 곰나니 방자를 기르바스 다는 탐이 차든스는 나스네 지에죠 방아죠 가상 이제 데비 둔바당 뇌셈당 태좀당 직다당 주림도시 촉순스네 탐이 차든는 나스는 지에 어디 된저 방위게 양용셰스네 근데 지에 인송아래도 용셰 탐이 차다 준비 안에 이제 응아스나 직다 주림도시 촉센 되네 태좀 안에 데비 de bala dumba dang ani no sems o tenzo na pangwe de ne yang yongxie ji de ne dumba chi de ne suki sapa sebi yongxie dang de ne sapa kun sebi yongxie o de ne chi ne de yongxie ku de ne ins gombang pangwe de bo os da tenzo 디 용셰데다 디 탐이 차다 튠비 용셰다 수기 사바세비 용셰다 사바군세비 용셰 디 숨보데 안에 곰람기 빵자 다 곰람기 빵자 된데 인스는 약강나 망부지 송송 어디 곰람기 빵자데 빵사비 젤라 디 캠바 이셰지여로 어디 이셰 된조데 안에 용셰스는 납기도와 어디 곰람기 빵위 제부 이셰 오스 다 용셰 굿지나 용셰 굿지의 요소마도.
So then we move on to the result of having relinquished the discards. So when we then have applied these 4 remedies, or we have traversed these 4 remedies, then comes the result, which is that the discards, which are the 5 views and the 5 non-views in total, as they are applied to the different classes of discards, then when they are abandoned, then they're the 9 full cognitions that have arisen. So when the discards are gone, then there are 9 full cognitions that are the result of the abandoning of the discards. So when the view of the transitory collections, for example, is eliminated, then the full cognition that has arisen is the cognition of selflessness. When the discard of doubt has been eliminated, then the cognition that would arise or has arisen is that of trust. Trust, doubt-free trust. And then when there's no more ignorance, as the discard of ignorance is eliminated, then knowledge has arisen. So in that way, we can think of the opposites of the discards, the knowledge that and the cognitions that are the opposing factors that completely flourish or completely manifest when the discards have been eliminated. And so they're then grouped again in some ways here. The 9 full cognitions constitute different cognitions based on the abandonment of the discards. So the results of having relinquished the discards are the 9 full cognitions. First, the full cognition of having exhausted the discards of the truth of suffering and of the truth of origin belonging to the desire realms. So the first full cognition is the cognition that arises, so the wisdom, the primordial wisdom, or the knowledge, the clarity that arises when the discards of the truth of suffering and the discards of the truth of origin belonging to the desire realm are completely abandoned. So these are the first 2 classes of discards in the desire realm, as we have seen them. So when they're gone, then the first full cognition arises. So that refers to the 5 views and 5 non-views that are discards when seeing the truth of suffering. And then there were the 7 discards to the seeing the truth of origin, being the 10 minus the view of the transitory collections, the extreme views, and the holding ritual and discipline as paramount. So those discards on the path in the desire realm are the first. So when they are gone, when they're exhausted, then this constitutes the first full cognition. The second and the third cognition are then the full cognition of having exhausted the discards of the truth of cessation and of the truth of the path. So these are then counted separately. While first the truth of suffering and the elimination of the discards of the truth of suffering and the truth of origin are counted together as one full cognition. Then second come the cognitions of the truth of cessation and the truth of the path, but enumerated separately. So individually, when all the discards to the seeing of all the discards that are being abandoned when seeing the truth of cessation are being abandoned, then the full cognition of the exhaustion of the discards of the truth of cessation arises, and similarly for the truth of the path. And here we're still talking about the desire realm, right? So the first 3 full cognitions apply to the exhaustion of the discards of the desire realm. Then when seeing to the truth of seeing, and then come the full cognitions of the 2 upper realms. Similarly, the 3 full cognitions related to the 2 upper realms, which result from the path without impediment of the path of seeing. So again, we look then at the 2 upper realms, the form and formless realm, And they also have the same set of 3 full cognitions, one applying to the seeing of the truth of suffering and origin, one applying to the seeing of the truth of cessation, and one applying to the seeing of the truth of the path. When all those discards are abandoned, then this gives us 3 more full cognitions that relate to the higher realms, so the form and formless realms. So with that, we then have 6 discards. So that replies to the path without impediment when that is seen. So the path of seeing here when the antidotes are present to these discards. And so then these full cognitions, these 6 types of full cognitions are present, are the result. And then comes the 7th, the full cognition of having abandoned the aspect of that conform with the inferior realms of desire. That is then counted separately. The abandonment of the different aspects of the realm of desire, the desire realm, when achieving the higher realms. So there are aspects to the grasping to the transitory collections, and there's then also the grasping to superiority of ritual and discipline, doubt, the inclination towards the sense pleasures, and the harmful mind that are all not present in the higher realms. So they are abandoned when moving to the higher realms from the desire realm. So the result of having suppressed, temporarily abandoned those things, those discards of the desire realm, then one reaches the higher realms. And their absence is then that full cognition, and then the full cognition of having exhausted the defilements of the form realms, then is the particular defilements of the form realm similarly. And last, the full cognition of having exhausted all defilements, which is then the culmination of all cultivation. So having or eliminating all the discards of the path of cultivation. After that has been done, then all discards are gone, and knowledge or primordial wisdom has fully arisen. So these last 3 result from having abandoned the discards of the path of cultivation. So the last 3, the full cognition of having abandoned the aspects that conform with the inferior realms of desire, the full cognition of having exhausted the defilements of the form realms, and the full cognition of having exhausted all defilements. These actually apply to the discards of the having abandoned the discards of the path of cultivation.
And 공도 지게 시비스 다 군중 덴바이 꼴라 죽도기도 야 강라 지게 시비다 녀몽바 꼴라 망보 레지 꼴라 망보지 시바 된조 탐지기 넘바 저데 간데rellam나 네 코르바르 코르발라 둥안 망보 깨바라 제베 사변도 규르베 유인스 네 지 넘버 다 메타 망보 유치기 양 제부 다 메타 망보 tene 중기 요바라 tene kunjungins ne dungal trapo dang number tramin na so mangbo kege wala tene ne rapto kewa dang ane 균마체 pardegi ken chine 균마체 ba kewe kenje namba yinde ane di mingla ane kunjungi demba sine she chawa yins di sabdo no kunjung demba ki namba de kunjung demba sine namba de kande yore lamna gyudang kunjung rapke gens ane meda aje kanesna dungal dempa ki namba de kande yore sina meda dungal tong tames lawana shingi tanda dila kunjung dempa de la gyudang kunjung rapke gens odene tatru ane kanesna tiring tatru je kunjung dempa ki namba de shi de lola je hakwa de tiring shi dus gyudang kunjung rapke gens tene 용시에 굴생지 무시 괴도스 tene 통람기 이시 계지 주룩생지 무시 괴도스 뭐들래.
And then we come to the last paragraph of this chapter. The disturbing emotions and karmas, just as they have been explained above, are the four aspects of the cause, origin, production, and condition for rebirth in samsara. Therefore, they are called the truth of origin. So this summarizes now what we have seen before, the many aspects of the disturbing emotions and karma that constitute the truth of origin. We have spoken about many different aspects to, or different explanations about karma, like karmic actions, and then we have also spoken about many different classifications and functions and so forth of afflictive emotions. And so together, these constitute really the seed or the causes for the suffering of samsara. So that's the first aspect of the truth of origin. It's to be a cause. And then because one cause can lead to many different results, we call it the origin. It's the origin of many, many different painful results within samsara. And it's also production, because through the presence of subtle or small causes, very hard to bear, very tough and hard to eliminate results arise, so many severe forms of suffering. So that's why we call it production. And then the condition for rebirth speaks about the fact that karma and afflictive emotions are the conditions that make again and again rebirth within samsara possible. So they're the conditions necessary for rebirth within samsara. And so this is then really why we call it the truth of origin, because of these different aspects, these different characteristics to the cause, to the origin of suffering, that karma and afflictive emotions are the causes, the origin, the production, and the condition for rebirth in samsara. And so these are the four aspects to the truth of origination, just as we have seen the aspects to the truth of suffering previously, that are that it is impermanent, painful, empty, and devoid of self-entity. So these, so when we said when we were talking about the truth of suffering, impermanence, being impermanent, being painful, being empty, and being devoid of self-entity were the four characteristics to the truth of suffering. Here now we have the characteristics of the truth of origin, which are cause, origin, production, and condition for rebirth in samsara. And these really have to keep in mind. We have to remember those, we have to know those 4 characteristics. As for this class, we have also looked at these 4 characteristics now, finally, of the truth of origin that summarize the nature of the truth of origin. And we have also seen the results of having relinquished the discards, being the 9 full cognitions. And we spoke in some detail about the 16 moments on the path of seeing. So all of this is what we discussed today.
Tine pechashana nganzo 단지 군중 최수 최시 제수 제시했으는 답변은 군중 덴발양디 시지고라 어디 지디가라 군중 최수에서나 군중 덴발기 넘바데 베나 단다랑 규당 군중 랍게 겐스 더 군중 최수에서나 단다 군중 덴바 녀몽바 레다 녀몽바 되네 되네 코르와 제게 유임바 되네 코르와라 양양네 군도 중도 주게요 와 되네 랍도 깨게요 와 깬게 제네 규마르 중게요 와 될라 예체바 되네 진짜 레도 세는 셈게 되네 오늘 하고 도바 어디는 되면 최수 되네 최시에서 되네 모ቱ니 되게 뉴바데 마냠네 모투니 대톱나 되네 최시에서 되네 제수 제수 딜레장다 제 슈체도 좋아 아니 데 모투니 데 좋아 어딘데기 다 데네스네 차르네 줘야래도 다디 단다페나 군중 덴방게 될라 데네스네 차례래도
So if we look at the truth of origin in light of these 16 moments of the path of seeing, we said that each of the truths has 4 moments to it, 4 aspects, being the acceptance of the phenomena, the knowing of the phenomena, the subsequent acceptance, and the subsequent knowing. And so, as for the truth of origin, the acceptance of the truth of origin refers to exactly that, to truly accept and bear the fact that the truth of origin, karma and afflictive emotions, are the cause, the origin, the production, and the condition for rebirth in samsara. And so to truly accept that and being able to acknowledge that is this acceptance with regard to the truth of origin. And so this is really like the thought, yes, this is exactly how it is. To really accept it for what it is, this truth of origin, in light of its 4 characteristics of being the cause, the origin, the production, and the condition for rebirth in samsara. And then the second moment, which is the knowing of the truth of origin, is then the continuum of that acknowledgement, of that acceptance, where its power cannot diminish, but continues in that way. And when it still becomes stronger than the subsequent 2 moments of subsequent acceptance and subsequent knowledge will also emerge or will be traversed. But as we've seen, this applies now subsequently to these 4 moments, to the seeing of the truth of origin, as we have talked about it when speaking about the 16 moments of the truth of the 16th moments of the path of seeing previously.
다만 생기더니 다나데 군중 덴바기 남발라 차교련 다나신 동알 덴바당 람제 덴바 고비 덴바 탐제라양 아니데 셰바 주루고데 데네스네 차니 트웨레 치바레스.
So, and just as we have seen it now applied to the truth of origin, the 16 moments of the path of seeing apply then similarly. So 4 of those 16 apply similarly to the other 3 noble truths. So the truth of suffering, the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path.
So tene kunjung temba kola ta shusi mar kunjung temba kordela zo de karele busuna le tang nyomong ba sing jile sons tene le de la le ge namdang da medamang le kewa megewa lungma ten sangche ge le tang same ge le la so tene mangoje ta le jile bres ane nyomong ba jile bres nyomong ba ge mingi namdang tene nyomong ba ge chele nyomong baten zo thonglam la kanjo pangire kumlam la kande pangire la do ane pena nyomong pang sana yang nyomong pang wi yong su shebe ku se yong she ku la do tiring lebe do ane yang nyomong baten zo gi nyembo la pena ane sine kare sunji me nyembo la do parche me bi lam namdo lam thangse me nyembo la do odinde gi nyomong ba chele ko ni meng da me de chine ode le da nyomong ba chi chimbares kunjung nang gi do na.
So with this now we have completed the discussion of the truth of origin, and just to summarize what we have seen there is that we saw that we mainly identify karma and afflictive emotions as the truth of origin, and we saw many different discussions, many different presentations of karma, of karmic actions in that discussion. So we talked about different classifications like virtuous, non-virtuous, and neutral karmic actions, or defiled karma and undefiled actions, and so on. And then in the truth of the afflictive emotions part of the truth of origin, we spoke about the disturbing emotions and their synonyms, and their different functions, different classifications, and finally also of which of these disturbing emotions are being discarded on the path of seeing and which are discarded on the path of cultivation. And today we also saw the result of that abandonment, of the discarding the discards, which is then the list of the 9 full cognitions. And we also spoke about the antidotes that bring forth these 9 full cognitions, which are the remedy of remorse, the path without impediment, the path of liberation, and the remedy of keeping distance. So that then concludes the discussion of the afflictive emotions as well, and the truth of origin generally. I'll stop here for today, and let's recite the dedication and aspiration prayers.
Chambalam Bawen Chendara Kemba Dan Kundo Sangbo Deyang Deshen De Da Kunji Chinsu Dalo Jin Kewan De Da Tamje Randu Ngoen Du Sum Shembe Jalwa Tamje Je Ngowa Kangla Chundo Ngaba De Da Gewe Zawa and the Gwen Yang Sangbo Jure Ramdu Novara and Sunam de Tamje Sibani Tomne Nebe Janam Pamjen Jenga Nache Balam Chubai Sibe Chole Rowan Rolwa Sho Kewan de Gewo Kun Sunam Yeshe Chozo Shin Sunam Yeshe Lejongwa Tamba Gunye Tobar Sho lo chu so do wara chinge labdo solo chu lamdo do war chinge labdo solo lam chulwa selwara chinge labdo so chulwa ye she so charwara chinge lamdo solo la so chela chalion
Lasso Jeyong. Okay, so welcome to week number 3, and you have by now maybe gotten the quiz from last week, and good luck with that. Try to hand it all in. A few of you haven't been very haven't submitted attendance quizzes, so if you haven't, and I returned the last 2 weeks attendance quizzes, but you have watched the recordings, please let me know so I can manually add your attendance and try to do it more consistently in the future. I would appreciate that. Okay, I'm gonna stop recording.